So new RPA, December 21 release. They're on track to releasing it in the next in 2 weeks. And today's class is part 3. And a quick review. It's the first major revision since 2014, and they've made quite a few changes. We reviewed quite a few of them already. Much of it's the same, but much of it is very new. And the biggest new thing, of course, is that grid. We've talked about it. And you're going to see again, like last time we met, again this week, I'm going to bounce back and forth between the paragraphs after paragraph 3, the grid is paragraph 3, between subsequent paragraphs and the grid, because they relate to each other quite a bit. You'll see how that works in a moment. All right. So, and again, remember, the grid's not a summary. It's actual terms of the contract. It contains time frames, amounts of money to be paid, and who's responsible for the payment. So it's substantial information contained in the grid that is contractual. The balance of the RPA, of course, is equally important, 14 through 16 pages. It contains explanations that explain the obligations of the buyer and the seller in the RPA. So you should study the entire RPA. The grid's actually pretty easy to get used to. And like I said, much of the body of pages 4 through 16 is very similar to the previous versions of the RPA, but there are some interesting additions to it and some clarifications. And of course, always call if you have any questions. I like to say I'm one call away. So let's talk about reviewing the new RPA page by page, paragraph by paragraph. And in part 1, we talked about paragraph 1, the offer itself, agency, paragraph 2, and paragraph 3, that grid. We went through 3A through 3L. So that recording is available if you would like to. I think Lindsay will email it to you. I think it's on YouTube or somewhere. I don't know. Okay. Part 2, a couple of weeks ago, we finished the grid, paragraphs 3M to 3R. We talked about paragraph 4, property addenda and advisories. We talked about how you can make the RPA apply to various purchases by using specific new addenda, and therefore they eliminated some of the purchase agreements from before. They're going to be gone in 2 weeks. Things like the probate purchase agreement is going to be gone. The manufactured home purchase agreement is going to be gone. And you use the addenda for that particular situation attached to the new RPA. Paragraph 5 talks about deposits and loans. Paragraph 6 talks about verifications and buyer stated financing. Part 3, what we're going to cover today, I hope we get through all of it. I'm going to do my best here. We're going to talk first about closing in possession, paragraph 7, then paragraph 8, contingencies, then items included and excluded. That's been substantially revised. And so we'll go through that in some detail. Allocation of costs, and then finally, disclosures, review the disclosure situation. So let's jump right into a review of the new RPA. So paragraph 7, we're picking up from where we left off last time, talks about closing and possession. So the buyer intends to occupy the property as indicated in 3E3. And again, that's the grid. So in the grid, paragraph 3E3, if you didn't check a box, the default was primary. So that was the owner occupant type situation. So if the buyer is going to occupy the property, then doesn't need to check a box. But if he's buying a secondary home or she's buying an investment property, then you would check the appropriate box. Now, condition of the property on closing, nothing's changed there either. The property shall be delivered as is in its present condition at the time of acceptance. And I've mentioned this before. I want to take this opportunity to mention it again. CAR and I, and lots of other people too, probably, advise that agents should resist if they can. Of course, if your buyer or your seller rather absolutely wants as is written in some counter offer, it's not, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is somewhat problematic. First of all, it's redundant, and that's not really why it's problematic. It's problematic because psychologically, it tends to suggest to sellers that their obligation to make disclosures is somewhat relieved because it doesn't matter. The property is as is. And CAR and I both have, apparently CAR's experienced it. I can promise you I've experienced it. Sellers sometimes, when challenged about why they didn't make a disclosure, their thought process often goes to, well, why does it matter? It's an as-is sale. I can tell you when a buyer makes a claim and there's something that wasn't disclosed according to the buyer, and then I call the seller and ask the seller about it, the seller sometimes will say to me literally, well, why is that a concern? It's as is. And that's a very problematic answer because it doesn't matter if it's as is, you still have to disclose everything. So the tip is you should avoid writing as is down because it suggests inadvertently, maybe subconsciously to the seller, somehow the disclosure requirements are somewhat diminished, and that's not the case. So I like to say, all sales in California, unless otherwise specified, are as is, and the buyer gets to discover what is. So that hasn't changed, by the way. Okay. The property, including pool, spa, landscaping, and grounds, are to be maintained in the condition it was at acceptance. That has not changed. Now, debris and personal property not included in the sale must be removed at close of escrow. Well, at the time, not exclusive escrow, at the time possession delivered with the buyer. So if there's a possession after close, then the debris can still be there. Personal property, of course, can still be there. Now, notice, and this is true of the current contract, and I still have agents that don't understand this, and that is there is no requirement to clean the property in the current contract or in the new contract. Some of the old timers, we remember when it used to say broom clean. It had to be, broom clean. Well, there were so many problems. What did that mean exactly? That back in 2014, CAR took that out of the contract, and it is still out in the new contract. So I like to say that if there are a bunch of dust bunnies under the bed and the seller moves the beds, the dust bunnies can remain, and the buyer bought the dust bunnies too. There's no obligation. Sometimes I've been told, agents will tell me, well, don't they have to clean the house when the seller leaves? No, they don't, unless you specify in the contract. Now, if that's important to your buyer, then specify that. Okay. Now, if items are not removed, this is new. This is new in the contract. By the way, it's common law anyway. So, but now they spell it out. If items are not removed when possession is delivered to the buyers, the items are deemed abandoned. And the buyer, after first delivering to the seller a notice to remove the items within 3 days, may pay to have such items removed, or they can take possession of them and claim them. But they first must give a notice and give the seller 3 days to remove the items before you can claim them or dispose of them yourself if you're the seller. Now, if the buyer has to dispose of the items, the buyer may bring a legal action and collect the cost of disposing the items from the seller. So this has been spelled out in the contract. That actually always existed in common law, but it's now spelled out. Buyers strongly advised to conduct investigations of the property to, again, to determine what that as is. And, they make a statement that, improvements may not even be to code, might not have permits, and might not comply with current law. All right, 7C, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. Now, if the seller has the right to remain in possession pursuant to paragraph 3M2, again, back to the grid, 3M2, if the seller is going to remain in possession, they check one of the boxes. If it's less than 29 days, they check the top box, and of course 30 days or more, the bottom box. Now, the differentiation is an attempt by CAR, and it was interesting. I just recently was talking to a CAR attorney, and they acknowledged to me too that they still don't have any case law to support what CAR is trying to do. What CAR is trying to do with an SIP, if it's 29 days or less, then you attach an SIP. If it's 30 days or more, you attach an RLAS. An RLAS, as all of you know, is a residential lease after sale. And that is a rental agreement. And so the buyer is truly a landlord, and the seller becomes a tenant, and landlord-tenant law will clearly apply for a 30-day or longer post-closing possession. And CAR, and I think they're correct, believes that the courts would rule that way automatically. No matter what document you use, they would say that's a rental agreement. The SIP, the SIP, for 29 days or less, first of all, they keep it under 30 to avoid that, sort of presumption that any possession 30 days or longer is a rental. And they try to avoid that. And they're trying to avoid the buyer inadvertently being sucked up into landlord-tenant law. The buyer does not want to be a landlord in all probability. If he plans to occupy the property, he is simply accommodating a seller to stay for 2 or 3 weeks, and then wants to take possession of his house. She has no intention of being a landlord. And so the terminology in the SIP, if you pay attention to it, is not rental type terminology. So I mentioned this before. You should try to, be careful when you talk about it. It's not critical, but it's just, don't add to the possibility that it'll be deemed a rental agreement no matter what by referring to any money that is going to be held until the seller gives possession as a deposit. It's not. It's a possession fee. And it's not a rent, it's a license fee to remain in the property. So that's the logic behind that. Okay. So parties are advised to consult with their insurance company and their legal advisors regarding the potential liabilities if a seller remains in possession. Buyers advised to check with their lender on what the impact to a lender would be if the seller's occupying the property. Lenders tend to be pretty okay with anything 30 days or less. They get a little concerned when it's more than 30 days. So we certainly want to advise our buyers that they should talk to their lender. Whether they do or not is up to the buyer. And of course, consult with a California real estate attorney to determine what the rights and responsibilities of the buyer and the seller are in this post-close possession. Close of escrow. The seller assigns the buyer any warranty rights. So anything that's under warranty, the seller assigns that to the buyer. Now, it's important to know that sometimes the warranties will not transfer. So you want to be sure to advise the buyer that even though the seller is assigning the warranties to you by contract, the entity that's issuing the warranty, they may not honor the buyer as a claimant on a warranty claim. So keep that in mind. Seller, upon close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed, if remains in possession, provide keys. This comes up all the time. The question is asked, okay, the seller is staying in the property. Does the seller have to give the keys? Well, the contract says yes. And in all probability, if no one's going to sue for the keys, in all probability wouldn't get to court in time. But the owner of the property is entitled to keys. Landlords are entitled to keys. In fact, lease agreements say that the tenants shall not change the locks, and if they do, they have to give the landlord a copy of the keys. And the reason is if there's a problem, an emergency, the owner of the home may have to access the property. What if the seller took a long vacation during their post-close possession and the water heater sprung a leak? The buyer's driving by and sees water coming out the garage door. They're going to want to get inside to address that issue and minimize damages. So they should be allowed the keys. Now, in the SIP, there is a box to check if, in fact, the seller is not going to provide the keys until they give possession. Sellers tend to like to check that box. Buyers tend not to have that box checked. The default is the seller provides keys. Now, the buyer should be advised, just because you have keys doesn't mean you get to go over there anytime you want. You should honor traditional landlord-tenant law when it comes to access to a property that you've given possession of it to another entity. So you don't just get to walk in. You have to give them notice, and you have to have good cause to go in. Okay. All the items included in paragraph 3P, which is all the personal property items that are included in the sale, are also provided. Okay. Upon when possession is given. Items included and excluded from the sale. So we just talked about possession, and we did mention that the items that are included are given to the buyer when the seller gives possession. But what is included and what is excluded from the sale? Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. That's the let me go back. The items listed in paragraph 3P, which is in the grid, and also items is listed in paragraph 9, which lists quite a few items, and we're going to cover that in a minute. Those are items that are included in the sale. All right, that's paragraph 9. The next paragraph is paragraph 8, contingencies and removal of contingencies. So first contingency talked about is a loan. So unless otherwise specified in 3L or an attached C.A.R., if they attach a C.A.R. to the offer, they can also remove contingencies with the offer that way. Paragraph 3L is discussing the loan and box no loan contingency. So if that box is checked, then it is not contingent upon a loan, but it otherwise is contingent if that box is not checked, and they're contingent on obtaining the specified loans. Now, if there is no appraisal contingency, or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, and again, it could be removed even with the purchase, it can be part of the grid, no appraisal contingency, then failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle the buyer to exercise the cancellation right pursuant to the loan contingency. So the contract makes it very clear that the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency are distinct. They're not related. Currently, the current offer suggests the same thing, but there is a tendency on buyers to, remove their loan contingency and say, well, that's okay, I have the appraisal contingency, or remove, even worse, their appraisal contingency and say, well, that's okay, I still have a loan contingency. If it doesn't appraise, I can't get my loan. It's very clear now in this contract that those do not link. So if you do not get your loan because it doesn't appraise, you can't use your loan contingency to cancel. If you can otherwise get the loan, you're qualified for the loan. It's simply that the property didn't appraise and you'd already removed your appraisal contingency. Okay, the buyer is advised to investigate the insurability of the property. The same thing there. Lenders require insurance, I think, in almost every case. And failure to get insurance is an investigation contingency. Whether the property is insurable at rates the buyer is comfortable with is an investigation contingency and not part of the loan contingency. So 8A2 clarifies that as well. The buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit and down payment are not contingencies. So that means that you should have required, if it wasn't submitted with the offer, you should require verification of funds, because the offer is not contingent upon getting funds unless the offer says that. If the offer says this offer is contingent on my parents giving me the money, well, then they would be contingent, but they're not by boilerplate contingent. Okay. If there is an appraisal contingency, removal of the loan contingency does not remove the appraisal contingency. So the appraisal contingency is separate from the loan contingency. If no loan contingency is checked in 3L, obtaining any loan is not a contingency of this agreement. So the buyer can still, want a loan, still specify a loan in paragraph 3L, but getting that loan is not a contingency if they've checked the box in 3L up at the top there. Okay. Got ahead of myself there. Okay, appraisal. Now, the second contingency is appraisal. We've talked about that a little bit, but the appraisal contingency is a unique contingency in 8B. And so this agreement, unless otherwise specified in 3L or a contingency removal form, is in fact contingent. And again, in 3L, 2, you could check the box, no appraisal contingency. Coincidentally, the only 2 contingencies that can be removed without a contingency removal form is the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency. All other contingencies here in 3L require a removal of the contingency using a C.A.R. form. But you can remove the loan contingency or the appraisal contingency by simply checking the box. Okay, so the property is contingent on appraisal at the appraised price, at the sale price, or whatever amount is listed in L2. So let's say they're buying the house for $800,000. The house is probably comps at $750,000. The buyer said, "That's okay. I'll pay $50,000 over appraisal. So I'll pay $800,000. But they may want to say, but only if it appraises at least $750,000. Because what happens if it appraises at $700,000? The buyer is going to say, well, I was going to pay $50,000 over appraisal, but I don't want to pay $100,000 over appraisal. So you can limit or adjust the appraisal contingency by checking this box and putting a lower amount in this box for situations where the buyer is willing to pay over appraisal, but wants a minimum appraisal before they're willing to do that. Hope that makes sense to everyone. Okay. The ability to cancel based on measurements in an appraisal is part of the investigation contingency. Again, the appraisal contingency is limited to the value of the property and is not to be used if the appraisal comes back and says, gee, the stove doesn't work, or, the square footage is only 2,200 square foot, not 2,600 square foot. Well, those 2 instances, the appraisal contingency is not the contingency that would protect the buyer. It would be the investigation contingency. So if the investigation contingency has already been removed, and then the buyer finds out the square footage is less than she thought or he thought, they cannot use the appraisal contingency to cancel and demand their deposit back. So any cancellation based upon the appraisal contingency, the buyer shall deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller if the seller requests it. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, but in general, sellers are not entitled to the appraisal, copy of the appraisal. That the exception, I'll tell you now, and I'll reinforce it in a few minutes. That's with FHA and VA loans, the seller is entitled to a copy of the appraisal. That's not well known, but that's true. And why is that true? Because that FHA appraisal and VA appraisal stays with the property, I believe, for 6 months, regardless of who the buyer is. So FHA appraisal comes in low, the buyer bails, the new buyer getting an FHA loan is not going to get a new appraisal. He's going to be she's going to have to use the same appraisal that the first buyer used. The lender will immediately find out, oh, there's already a FHA appraisal or VA appraisal. So for that reason, the seller is entitled to a copy of that appraisal, because that seller has to deal with that now going forward with any subsequent purchasers. All right. If no appraisal contingency is checked in 3L, again, right up there, the buyer may not use the loan contingency specified in 3L to cancel the agreement. So the loan contingency, they might still have the loan contingency, but if they remove their appraisal contingency, they cannot use that situation. Okay. You cannot cancel this agreement for the sole reason of not obtaining a loan if that is only because the appraisal the lender was using was a requirement to make the loan, but you've already removed the appraisal contingency and you qualify for the loan otherwise, then you would have not a reason to cancel, because you no longer have the appraisal contingency, even if you couldn't get the loan because of the appraisal. And of course, that's assuming you could get the loan if it appraised, but lender's not going to give you the loan if it doesn't appraise, but you're still not going to be able to use the loan contingency because the buyer qualified for the loan, the property didn't, and there's no appraisal contingency. And that dollar amount, if that's the purchase price, or a lower amount if the buyer so chooses. Okay, investigation of the property. This agreement is specified in 3L3. Investigation of property is contingent on the buyer accepting the condition of the property after performing his investigations. Review of seller documents. This agreement is also contingent, according to paragraph 3L4, for review of seller documents. So you get seller documents and you review them and you don't like them as the buyer, then the buyer could exercise the review of seller documents contingency to cancel. So this new contract breaks up some of these contingencies. Like in the past, seller documents was part of the investigation contingency. Now it's a unique contingency. Okay, so review of seller documents contingent upon buyer's review of seller documents as required in 14A. 14A, the seller has to provide documents within the time frame specified, and default is 7 days, and that's contained in 3N1. And once the seller provides those documents, if the buyer is not happy with what they contain, the buyer could exercise the seller document contingencies to cancel. Okay, the next contingency is title. And so this agreement, as specified in 3L5, a preliminary title report contingency is contingent on the buyer's ability to obtain a title policy as specified in 13G. We won't get there today, but 13G talks about the title policy, and we'll talk about that next time we meet. So the buyer and the buyer's review of the preliminary title report for items disclosed or observable, even if not on the report and not specified in the title report, but still matters affecting title nonetheless. Then the buyer has a right to review that. And if he's not satisfied with that, if she's not satisfied with that, they could exercise this contingency. The buyer is advised to review all underlying documents and matters affecting title. Now, this is an important point, and I tell agents this all the time, and many of you are doing it. A few of you might want to start this practice, and that is every time you get a title report, you should do two things. And one is to encourage your buyer to click on every single link in that title report. And you should do the same. Why? Because you have more knowledge about items on title than the buyer does. And so the buyer is going to look at something and have not a clue what it means. And if you click on it and you don't have a clue what it means, then you probably should make a call to me or to your manager. And what does this mean? But you might see, oh, this is a pace lien. Okay, I see that. And then, you want the buyer to be aware of that. This property has a PACE lien on it. Sometimes property is sold. The seller says, I own the solar. Well, it's amazing how often sellers don't quite understand the how that solar got on their property. You don't own it, you're leasing it. And when I review the title report, I see a lien, a CBC lien on the panels on the roof, which clearly tells me, okay, somebody else owns those panels. In a leasing situation or in a power production contract situation for solar panels, the seller, the owner of the home, does not own those panels. The leasing entity or the power production company owns those panels, and they file a lien on the property. And so you can discover that by clicking on the links. Another common link that we've had problems with, buyers didn't realize such a thing existed, is a private road agreement. And again, law requires all private road agreements to be recorded on title. So there's going to be a link on title to that private road agreement, and there may be a ton of information about that private road agreement, and it can be a lot of material, and it can have a very large financial impact. We have a client who is a part, I think there's 4 people that are parties to this private road agreement, and they're being, that private road, that group of 4 people are being assessed $160,000 for improvements related to that private road by, I think, the city of San Marcos, I believe, maybe a different city. So clearly, the buyer would want to be aware of the private road agreement and then do a little investigation pursuant to that. And of course, the seller would have an obligation to disclose any information they know about their private road agreement. And if there's currently an assessment relative to that private road agreement that the seller is dealing with, they would be obligated to disclose that as well. But it might start with simply accessing the title report, clicking on the link, and then discovering that there's a private road agreement and then investigating that. Okay, buyer has 5 days after receipt of a revised preliminary report to approve it or cancel if it contains substantial deviations or material deviations from the original report. So CAR uses the example that if they misspelled the seller's name and they issue a revised report, and the buyer's already removed their title contingency, it's not going to be reinstated because the seller's name was misspelled. But if they said, oh my gosh, there's an encroachment, we didn't even realize, we were out there plotting the easements with the buyer, and we discovered an encroachment, and so we added that to our title report. Well, the buyer, that would be a material or substantial deviation from the original title report, and the buyer would have those 5 days. All right, condominium and planned development property disclosures. If the agreement is as specified in 3L6, common interest disclosures, is contingent upon the buyer's review of those disclosures. And under paragraph 11K, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, hopefully I get that far, they're going to have an opportunity to review that information, and the transaction is contingent upon their approval of those disclosures. In other words, the HOA documents, that's what we're talking about here. Okay. Paragraph 8G, buyer review of leased or liened items. So the buyer's review and the ability and willingness to assume any lease or maintenance agreement or other financial obligation, or to accept the property subject to any lien, disclosed pursuant to paragraph 9B6, which goes into some detail about leased and liened items. We'll talk about that in a moment. or as specified in paragraph 3L7, review of leased items, is a contingency of this agreement. So if something on that property is leased, the buyer has a right to review that lease, the terms of that lease, and their willingness to assume that lease, their ability to assume that lease is a contingency of the agreement. Any assumption of the lease shall not require a financial obligation or contribution by the seller. Sometimes sellers pay down a lease to help a buyer, or a buyer's requiring it because they want, some financial relief from the obligations of that lease, and a seller can certainly do that, but they're not obligated to do that. The seller, after giving a notice to perform, may cancel the agreement. The seller, after giving the buyer a notice to perform, may cancel the agreement if that by the time specified in 3L7, the review of leased items, default at 17 days, if the buyer refuses to enter into a necessary written agreement with the leasing entity or accept responsibility for all the obligations of the seller disclosed leased or liened item. So if the buyer does not accept the solar lease, for example, or can't qualify for the solar lease, the seller, after giving a notice to perform for the buyer to accept it, qualify for it, or the seller will cancel, and after giving the notice to perform, they may cancel. Removal or waiver of contingency with the offer. The buyer has no obligation to remove contingencies unless the seller has provided all required documents. So removal of contingencies with the offer is a voluntary act by the buyer. They're not obligated to do it unless they've received all documents. Now, the buyer can still do that even though they haven't received all documents, and there could be some problems associated with that in both cases. I'll talk about that in a minute. Some disclosures are going to give the buyer back the contingencies. Other disclosures will not. If the buyer in fact, here it is. If the buyer does remove a contingency without first receiving all required information from the seller, the buyer is relinquishing any contractual rights that apply to that contingency. Now, that does not apply to statutory disclosures that would include the TDS, the natural hazard zone report from a third party, natural hazard company, the lead-based paint disclosure, if it's applicable, and the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure, if that's applicable. Those will automatically reinstate a contingency. But if the buyer removes a contingency for HOA documents, or the buyer's investigation of property, and then gets a disclosure like the HOA disclosure, or gets an SPQ, and talks about something that's not part of the TDS, that would not reinstate the disclosures. Perhaps the most common is the HOA. Buyers removing HOA contingencies, they don't get it back when they get the HOA documents. So, removing a contingency and then getting information from the seller does not necessarily reestablish the contingency. Now, if the buyer removes or waives any contingencies without adequate understanding of the property's condition or the buyer's ability or willingness, I would say, to purchase the property, the buyer is acting against the advice of the agent. So we're advising our agents not to remove contingencies till you get all of the document from the seller. The seller cannot compel you to remove contingencies unless the seller has provided you the related documents that go with that contingency. Okay, removal of contingency or cancellation for any contingency specified in 3L, which is this whole list of contingencies, or in paragraph 8, which is the paragraph we're talking about here, buyers shall, within the time specified, remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. And for contingencies for review of seller documents, preliminary report, title report, and the HOA documents, buyers shall, within the time specified in 3L, which is by default 17 days, or you can change it, or 5 days after receipt of those documents, whichever occurs later, remove the applicable contingency. Again, they can remove it early if they want. They cannot be compelled to remove it sooner than 3L or 5 days after receiving the paperwork, if you will, the documents from the seller, whichever is later. Now, if the buyer does not remove a contingency when time specified, the seller can give the buyer notice to perform and then cancel the agreement. All of you are pretty familiar with that. And then J, I think that's the final contingency. The buyer's purchase is contingent upon the seller's purchase of another property. The default is it is not contingent upon the sale of another property owned by the buyer. However, if paragraph 3L is checked, COP attached, sale of buyer's property is not a contingency unless checked. And if that's checked, then it is a contingency of the purchase, the sale of the buyer's property. Okay, items included and excluded from the sale. Now, this has been revised quite a bit, starting with the grid and then paragraph 9 as well. So we'll go through that. I'll try to get through that quickly. Note to the buyer and the seller. This is an important note. Items listed in the MLS, flyers, marketing materials, and disclosures are not included. Well, they are not included in a purchase price or excluded from the sale unless specified in paragraph 3P or otherwise stated. So the MLS might say, refrigerator, dishwasher, goes with property, unless the buyer checks dishwasher and a refrigerator, or not dishwasher, but that you could argue that does go, but washer, dryer, and refrigerator. So the MLS says washer, dryer, refrigerator convey. Unless it's checked on this box, they do not convey. I mean, they don't have to convey. The seller can still convey them, but if the seller changes their mind, gee, I could use that refrigerator in my house after all, or hey, my kids need a refrigerator, I think I'll give them my refrigerator. Unless this box is checked, it's not going to convey, simply because it's in the MLS. The MLS is not part of the contract. Likewise, another issue that comes up from time to time is it's checked on the TDS that something is included in the property. It is not contractual. The TDS is making a mistake. The seller is disclosing something that's not in fact true, unless they do in fact include it with the purchase. So it must be part of the contract. The TDS does not bind the seller to deliver the items checked on the TDS. Only the contract does. Likewise, other items are listed in paragraph 9B. Any items included herein are components of the home and are not intended to affect the price. That's, for the lender's benefit. Items are transferred without seller warranty. So any item, refrigerator, yeah, I'll leave my refrigerator, but I don't know how long it'll run, and I'm not responsible for it. All right. Items included in the sale. Of course, and some of this is already what you're familiar with, and some of this is a little new. All existing fixtures and fittings attached to the property. That's a general description. Paragraph B2, 9B2, goes into some detail. So all existing electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, heating, ceiling fans, fireplace inserts, gas logs and grates, and solar power systems, they're included. Built-in appliances, that's why the dishwasher. Appliances with special openings or encasements, that would include a dishwasher per se. Whether or not checked in 3P. So even though the dishwasher is not checked, one could argue the dishwasher conveys because there's a special opening or encasement for that dishwasher. Okay. Windows and door screens, awnings and shutters. That's pretty standard, pretty much the same. Window coverings have been expanded a little bit. Apparently CAR gets lots and lots of questions about what a window covering is. It includes blinds, curtains, drapery, shutters, and any materials that cover any portion of the window. So they're included. Attached floor coverings, television antennas, satellite dishes, Again, satellite dishes might be leased. So it's going to be important. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Air conditioners and air coolers, they're included. This is also new. Pool and spa equipment was always part of it, but they've expanded that now, including but not limited to cleaning equipment, such as motorized and automatic pool cleaners, pool nets, pool covers, all the things associated with the pool, they're included. Garage door openers, remote controls, that's pretty much the same. Mailboxes, in-ground landscaping, always the case. Water features and fountains, that's always been a question. Gee, is the water featured? Does the fountain convey or not? Yes, it does, because it's in the boilerplate here of 9B2. Water softeners, water purifiers, light bulbs, including smart bulbs. I've actually had a buyer call me and complain that seller took all the bulbs out. I don't know. Okay. But that's, contract says light bulbs stay. All right. Items specified in 3P, which is all these items here. You can check them. If currently existing at the time of acceptance. So isn't that interesting? If in fact something on 3P is checked, but there isn't one, the wine refrigerator is checked, but the seller says, I don't have a wine refrigerator. Does that mean I got to go get one? No. If it currently existed at the time of acceptance, then it conveyed. But if it didn't exist, as long as you can document that, the buyer's not going to get one just because they checked the box saying wine cooler. All right. If the seller does not intend to include an item as being included because it is not owned by the seller, this is important, whether placed in the property by an agent, a stager, or any other party, that item should be listed as being excluded in 3P, excluded items, or excluded by the seller in a counteroffer. You may not have the opportunity to fill in anything on 3P because you can't write in as a seller or listing agent above the buyer's signature. So the buyer checks something that they want you to include, and the seller says, she's not going to include it. He's not going to include it. Well, then the seller should counter it out. Okay, now, where this is important is the buyer does not know if something is owned by the seller or not, if it's in the property. So if the curtains, CAR uses this example, if the curtains of the house had poor curtains or no curtains, and so a stager put up gorgeous curtains, but they're owned by another entity, not the seller, the buyer has no way of knowing that. And simply saying that in the MLS wouldn't work anyway because of what I've already reviewed. So the seller must exclude those items, or the seller is going to end up being obligated to provide them because they're part of the contract, whether they're owned by the seller or not. So that is real important with all the staging going on. If the buyer is asking for something that in fact not owned, we had a problem with pool equipment, and the buyer specified the pool equipment to convey. They actually wrote that, and the seller did not counter it out, and the seller took all the pool equipment. This is a fancy cleaner. I guess a pretty expensive little robot that crawls around the bottom of a pool. I don't know. I don't have a pool, but I found out they're very expensive. The seller claimed that did not belong to him. That would belong to the company that serviced his pool. And that was quite a fight. Under the new contract, the seller would lose that fight. Okay. Security systems. So any devices, hardware, software, control units, monitors, including but not limited to motion detectors and window alarms, are as specified in 3P. If there's anything they're checked, then they are included in the sale, whether they're hardwired or not. So if they're remotely connected, they're still included. Okay. Home automation systems. So any electronic devices not limited to thermostat, controls, kitchen appliances, and otherwise not excluded. So if they're not excluded, then they are in fact included. Lighting systems that are connected, hardwired or not. Any control unit or computer, tablet, or smart device that is affixed to the property, that is included. If they are physically affixed to the real property, that also existing light bulbs, they're included in the property. The buyer's advised to use 3P1 to clarify what they want. That's just a good idea. And the seller's advised to use a counter to clarify what they don't. In general, most security stuff is going to be included. Now, non-dedicated devices. Some of these security systems are controlled by your cell phone or your personal notebook computer, the items that are in 3P. Some of these things are controlled by a non-dedicated device. You have a cell phone that controls your Ring doorbell or something. I don't know. You don't get the cell phone. So if it's a non-dedicated device, they are not included, even though they're used to control the device. The buyer acknowledges that a separate device and access to Wi-Fi or internet may be required to operate some of these features. And so the buyer would have to obtain one of their own devices after close of escrow. And of course, the buyer should change passwords on any device they do get with the purchase. Leased and lien items, any leased or liened items that are within the time specified in 3N1, seller delivery of documents shall be disclosed to the buyer if the item or system specified in 3P or 9B, 3P right here, if one of these items, or 9B, any of this general stuff, 9B2, is leased or not owned by the seller or subject to a maintenance type of agreement, then the seller must disclose that. Delivery to the buyer of all written materials, such as lease and warranty and financing, must be provided with the items that the seller doesn't own, so the buyer can determine whether or not he wants to lease it. Seller represents that all items included in the purchase price, unless otherwise agreed, are owned by the seller. There you go. So the drapes are owned by the seller is what is being in general stated. So if they're not, if the refrigerator's asked for, but no, that was put in there by my brother, my refrigerator went out, my brother loaned me his. Well, now I sold my house and that refrigerator was asked for in the contract and I agreed. The fact that I didn't own the refrigerator is going to be a problem because I'm alleging that I owned it and I'm transferring it. So I have to state that it's not. I'm going to deliver it free of any encumbrances, and I have to state that it is not owned. Okay. Pursuant to paragraph 9B6, anything that's not owned right here, I have to list what's not owned, just the paragraph we just covered. They're transferred to the seller without warranty unless I exclude them. And the seller shall cooperate with identifying the software applications and buyer's efforts to transfer any services to operate any smart home features included in this agreement. Okay. Items excluded from the sale. Unless otherwise specified, the following items are excluded from the sale. Any item specified in 3P2. So if something is listed here, maybe the MLS said, stained glass window excluded or chandelier excluded. So the buyer, agent not wanting a counter, goes ahead and puts chandelier and checks it to avoid getting a counter because the seller might automatically counter that if I don't put that in my offer. Okay. So audio and video components such as flat screen TVs and that, if not attached physically to the property, are excluded. Even if a bracket is how they're attached, then they are excluded. If they're attached directly, like speakers actually bolted to the wall, they're going to convey. But if they're attached by a bracket, then they're not going to convey. Same with furniture that has some sort of a earthquake safety strapping. Bookcases, for example, commonly have a strap that holds them upright in case there's an earthquake. So the fact that does not make them a fixture. Okay, unless otherwise specified in 3P, which is where you list all the items that are included. In 3P, the wall bracket, that's what we're talking about here. If you check this box, then the wall brackets will be included, but otherwise, unless otherwise specified. But if they're not specified, if that box is not checked in 3P1, then the brackets are to be removed and the holes patched but not painted. That's a change from the current contract. Now the current contract says the brackets stay unless the seller agrees to remove them. Now it says they go unless the buyer agrees that they can stay. Okay. Allocation of costs. We'll try to get through this. We might run about 10 minutes long if I can move through this quickly. I might not get to paragraph 11. Might stop here at 10. Allocation of costs. Reports and any reports and certificates in paragraph 3Q. So that would be the natural hazard and report, any other reports, and any government reports. This might be a termite report. Q2, Q3 might be a septic system report. So any reports only determines who pays for the inspection report. Does not, 3Q does not specify who pays for work necessary in Q1, 2, and 3 or Q5. Who pays for any work the report requires, commonly like the termite report. Now let's say it's termites and it needs to be tented. 3Q doesn't state who pays for the termite work. It simply says who pays for the reports. Likewise with government required reports. Okay. Only determines who pays for the inspection. Does not determine who pays for the work. Agreements to pay for the work should be specified elsewhere in 3Q or 3R. In 3Q or 3R. 3R is the best place to do it. So that's where you'd write termite report. Now, CAR will tell you they do not like buyers or sellers rather agreeing to do repairs in the purchase agreement. They like the work to be agreed to in a separate agreement, an RR, an RRRR, or an addendum, or an AEA, which is a sort of a counter offer type addendum. They prefer that, for example, the termite work be specified in RR. The paying for the termite work, and then the seller can respond in RRRR. Now, there's a good reason CAR feels that way, and they're really adamant about it. They're on a mission to try to get agents not to ask for repairs subsequent to a report until the report's been issued. Why? Because I've had the same experience. Seller agrees to a clear termite and then gets the termite report and finds out it's going to cost them $40,000 to get a clear termite. Neither the listing agent or the seller had a clue that it'd be that expensive. So now you've got a major problem. My argument against that is shame on the listing agent and the seller to agreeing to a clear termite without first knowing what it would cost to do that. CAR's solution is simply don't ask for the work. And I understand where they're coming from. And I'm not suggesting that you don't follow CAR's recommendation. But when I listed and sold, I knew that when my buyer bought a property, they wanted to buy the property. And if they needed termite work and they wanted the termite work done, they wanted to have that agreed to as part of the purchase. Because if the seller was not going to agree to the termite work, maybe we would put an offer on a different house. I don't have money to pay for termites. It's all the money I got to buy this house. I want the seller to give it to me free and clear of termites. So I can understand why a buyer would like to have a termite report and termite clearance in the offer, because if you don't put it in the offer and the seller later says, I'm not going to give you a clearance, the buyer's, that far into the transaction and doesn't have much recourse. So my only suggestion is for listing agents, if you're going to agree to providing a clear termite, you should have a report in hand or limit the amount of money you'll spend. I used to do that when I sold, and of course the numbers are a lot higher today, but I could tent most of the houses I sold. I wouldn't tent them, but they could be tented for $3,000 or less. A typical home, this is a long time ago. So I used to, as a listing agent, cap the termite clearance at not more than $3,000. And so I could get the house tented. I prepared the seller for the fact that you may have to have your home tented, but the good news is your buyer paid full price, and you're going to get to make that move right on time and buy that other house that you already under contract to buy. And so we'll just factor in, worst case, you're going to spend $3,000 for a termite clearance. So you cap it, or you have the report ahead of time and you know what it's going to cost, and then you deal with that in your offer. So the little comment there on that. All right. Government required requirements and corrective remedial action, legally required installations and property improvements. So there's a requirement for smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors and water heater strapping, and that's required to be completed within 7 days of acceptance by contract. It has to be completed by a transfer of the property. The seller has to certify that the water heater is strapped and that the smoke alarms, the carbon dioxide detectors, not monoxide, but carbon dioxide detectors are in fact installed. So if the buyer is to pay for those items, then the buyer must instruct escrow to hold funds to pay for it or pay the vendor directly. It is negotiable who pays for it, but the work must be done prior to close of escrow. Buyer must deliver to seller a document saying that they are in compliance, and that's part of the TDS, of course. If the seller is to pay for these items and does not fulfill the seller's obligation in time specified, which is that 7-day window, and the buyer incurs extra costs, then the seller is responsible for those costs. Point of sale requirements. The point of sale requirements, any point of sale requirements, reports and repairs required to complete at the close of escrow, that those are identified. So the parties, unless otherwise agreed to another time frame, will perform such repairs and be sure they're completed prior to the final verification of the property. So any point of sale requirements. There are no point of sale requirements in the county of San Diego. Not true in LA, but in the county of San Diego, the only point of sale requirement is in the city of San Diego, and that can even be transferred to the buyer, and that's for water conserving low flow water fixtures. But otherwise, there's no point of sale requirement, even though the law might require that the property have a carbon monoxide detector. The law does require that, but that's not a point of sale requirement. So a buyer could buy a house, a seller could sell a house. The house would simply not be in compliance to the law, but there's no point of sale requirement that the carbon monoxide detector be there. The carbon dioxide detectors, that is a point of sale requirement, and water heater strapping is a point of sale requirement statewide. And like I said, low flow fixtures in the city of San Diego is a point of sale requirement unless assumed by the buyer. All right. So that's as otherwise agreed. Buyer agrees to pay for any portion of such repair directly to the vendor if the buyer agrees to assume the cost for a point of sale requirement and provide escrow and invoice. Buyer shall provide within the time specified, which is again 7 days, unless otherwise specified, a copy of any required government-conducted point of sale inspection report prepared pursuant to the agreement. Okay. Reinspection fees. If the work's not done on time, then the reinspection fees would be the seller's obligation. This is particularly with a lender. If a lender, goes to the property and there's not a smoke detector installed, the lender may have to have the appraiser go back out once the smoke detector is installed, and then the lender is going to charge, and the seller would be responsible for that. Information and advice on requirements. The seller is advised to seek information on what local mandates exist. I've told you what they are, so you're okay there. And then finally, home warranty. The buyer should choose the coverage, and it's not chosen by the seller. It can be, but the default is the buyer chooses the coverage and then whoever pays for it is specified in 3Q. So who pays for it and what the cost is specified in 3Q. And the buyer is informed that there are optional coverages, and the buyer might want to avail themselves to getting optional coverage and make sure that the amount of money that they're asking the seller to pay would include the cost of the optional coverage. But the buyer specifies the optional coverage at the time the home warranty order is placed. It's not part of the purchase contract. If the buyer waives the purchase of a home warranty, the buyer can still purchase a home warranty after close of escrow. Folks, I'm going to wrap it up right there, and we're going to pick it up with paragraph 11 next time we get together. So I don't want to run any longer than we are now, except to answer any questions. So, Lindsay, do we have questions?
Yes, we have some questions.
All right. Okay.
Okay, so Catherine Bellinger wants to know, is the home to be left in broom sweep condition?
No. I mean, you can specify it, but that is not any longer part of the contract. That was eliminated back in 2014. The obligation of a seller to clean the house went away in 2014. So any cleaning that the buyer wants needs to be specified in the contract. I know some agents are still requiring the home to be professionally cleaned prior to close of escrow, and that's perfectly legal, but you have to specify that. You do not have to clean the house. I've had buyers call me and complain the stove was filthy, the house is filthy, bathrooms weren't clean. And, unfortunately, if we represent the buyer, we should have probably talked to the buyer about that when we wrote the offer and pointed that out to the buyer. That is a common problem, by the way. I know it's sort of petty, but if I'm a buyer's agent, on my list of things to talk about when I'm writing the offer is to tell them the seller's not obligated to clean the house. Hopefully these sellers will. You're showing them a beautiful house. It's perfectly clean. You could say, one would hope they keep it clean, but they're not obligated to. Well, I want it clean. Well, then we need to put that down. Okay.
Vicky Varnals wants to know, how does the buyer send written notice to the seller if they don't have their forwarding info? Can sending notice to the seller's agent be sufficient?
Great question, Vicky. There is some, and I've had this come up more than a few times. When does our agency responsibilities end? And one would argue they don't last forever, of course, but the buyer is going to discover debris in the property the day he takes possession. And so one would argue that you can give that. You're going to know immediately. I don't want this crap. So give the buyer's agent or the seller's agent that notice and ask them to forward it. And hopefully that constitutes delivery. But that if the listing agent's not going to cooperate with you, you might have escrow. Can you forward this to the seller? You don't need the address, but a third party would forward it to you. If the listing agent won't do it, I think escrow probably would.
Drew Reynolds wants to know when they're supposed to start using this RPA.
The RPA is supposed to be released the week of the 15th. So what's that, the 13th? I think that week. I checked, they didn't know what day, but they did say they're on schedule. They were concerned a while ago because there's 100 and some, I'm sorry, not 100. There are 63. I don't know why I said 100. There are 63 ancillary forms that have also been revised to go along with this. And so they were under the gun a little bit to get that done because they want to release them all at once. A week ago, I was talking to one of the attorneys at CAR and they told me they're on track.
And Vicky Bartles asks, regarding the items conveying that are in the MLS, if a buyer's agent puts on item 3P under additional, all items listed in the MLS, is this sufficient to convey?
I would, if as a buyer's agent, I would not put that down. I would list the items. As a seller's agent, if you're willing to convey all those items, I would restate specifically what they are and list them, because the problem is the MLS is not a part of the contract. So it does create a little bit of a problem because, you know, a lot of times, I don't want to get in the weeds here, but a lot of times when I'm writing up, especially settlements and releases, I need to incorporate documents. And so you see this phrase from time to time. I use it commonly, and that is an attached, you know, the item is attached herein and incorporated into the agreement. So if they were to do that with the MLS, the legal way to do that is to say all items in the MLS to convey MLS printout attached herein and incorporated in the agreement. Otherwise, it's the MLS is not a contract document. It's not a contract piece of paper. Nobody's signing the MLS, you know, so that's a very problematic way to do it. I mean, you know, no harm, no foul. Everybody agrees and everybody's okay with it. I'm not worried about it, but I would specify the items if I'm a buyer's agent, and I would, if the buyer's agent uses MLS, I would come back as a seller's agent and specify the items.
And then Andrea Castaneda would like to ask you a question. Andrea,
Hey, Walt. Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. For 3L2, I wanted to ask, you gave the scenarios about, you know, writing in the purchase price, even if the offer is higher, what have you. But let's say the list price is $700,000, okay? Mm-hmm. And a buyer offers $800,000. Mm-hmm. And under 3L2, they write, as long as it appraises for $750, they're willing to give the $800, right? So that's them saying, I'll give $50,000 over, I'm willing to pay up to $50,000 over the appraisal, right?
Right.
Does that, let's say the appraisal comes in at $7 because it was priced right. It comes in what it was listed at. Does the seller accepting the $750 in there obligate the seller in any way to say, okay, I agree, Mr. Buyer, you're willing to pay $50,000 over. So if it comes in at $7, I'm committed now to take $750. Because we have this issue now on the contract where someone says, I'll pay $15,000 over the appraisal. And somehow agents are thinking that that means that the seller's saying, I'll take $15,000 over the appraisal, instead of it meaning the buyer's stating what the buyer's willing to do should we fall short.
All right, that's a great.
Does that make sense?
It makes a complete sense.
Okay.
And let me unpack that a little bit because you got several issues there. So for the first question is, if in your original example, the number you put in that blank is simply the minimum amount that the property has to appraise for, but the seller is under no obligation to sell it less than the agreed to purchase price in the RPA.
Perfect.
So
okay.
The RPA will say 800. The buyer says, I will pay 800 as long as it appraises for 750, and it appraises at 7. Two things happen, one good for the seller, one good for the buyer. The buyer has his appraisal contingency in place. It didn't appraise, I can get out. The seller is not obligated to sell it for 7 or 750. The purchase price is 800. So the short answer on your question is, what you put in that blank that's simply affecting the appraisal contingency. It's not affecting the purchase price. Now, that is why, and anybody on this call me, because wording how much a buyer will pay and how much a seller will accept related to an appraisal is very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
What you stated, I could see a seller having a problem. Buyer agrees to pay $50,000 over appraisal. Okay, so the comps say 700, the buyer offered 800, he'll pay 50 over appraisal, and it appraises for 700. one could argue the seller agreed to sell it for $750. Why? Because of the way that was worded. I've argued it both ways, and not to get myself out on a limb here, but I've won both times. But I'm not real comfortable with either way to argue. The fact that the buyer agreed to pay doesn't mean the seller agreed to accept. That was the argument on how I saved the seller. When we had the buyer, look, the buyer agreed to pay it and you agreed to accept it. And the seller agreed, the seller's agent, it was only about $10,000 difference. So it wasn't a big deal. I didn't accomplish anything really big there. But to make my point, number one, what you put in that blank does not affect the purchase price at all. Number two, if you are going to mess around with, how much over appraisal you're going to pay and all that, give me a call. I'm only a call away, and let me help you word it correctly. I've done a webinar on that. I have a handout that I've sent out. Lindsay sends it out for me when I can't find it quick enough. But I have a handout that has 4 different ways to address that issue.
Okay, thank you.
Grace wants to know, does the door ringer equipment remain with the property?
If it's dedicated, yes, assuming the box was checked. If it's not dedicated, then no. So I don't know what you say, door ringer equipment. I was involved in a transaction that had and I don't have one of these doorbells. They're kind of neat, I guess. Some of you do have them, but a Ring doorbell, and it was completely controlled by the cell phone and linked to the seller's cell phone. And so the cell phone didn't convey, but all of the other stuff with that Ring doorbell did convey, but not the cell phone, because the cell phone wasn't dedicated to that Ring device.
So if I can just follow up to that.
Right.
According to the old contract, that none of that was in there.
Right.
Are the sellers allowed to come back and tear that off the wall?
Well, I without, specifically you and I can talk, but in general, no. If you've got to tear something off the wall, because I would argue it's an attached fixture or device. So does a doorbell convey? Yes. Why? Because it's attached to the wall. If I've got a wire coming out of the wall and it's got a plug, and then it's plugged to a foghorn because I'm some kind of goofy nautical guy, and when you ring my doorbell, I like my foghorn to go off. Well, that foghorn may not convey. Now, the reason I give you that example is I actually had a seller who had a doorbell connected to a train whistle. Until the police made him not do that anymore. But when his visitors rang his doorbell, his diesel locomotive train whistle made a little blast, and it was loud. So that train whistle did not convey, but the doorbell would have, because it was bolted to the wall. Does that help?
Yes, totally. Thank you.
Sharon Miller wants to know what the date 12/21 is for. I believe she's referring to the revised date.
Right, that's the revision date. If you look at forms, they don't give you a day of the month. All form revision dates are the name of the month, like December, DEC-21. Right now, I think we're on, what's the one that we have now is October of, it's more than 14. I think it's 18 or something like that, because they've made a few minor revisions. But that's the form revision date. Does that answer the question?
So when are we to begin using this new form? The 21st, the 15th? I'm confused about that.
Okay, do not use
year. 21 is the year.
Yeah, 21's the year. So
Got it.
C-21. It's supposed to be released the week of the 15th. That's the week, that's when it's supposed to be released. And traditionally, they tend to release it later in the week, not early in the week. Everybody's anxious to get this form. And if they're on track, maybe they do it Monday. I don't know. When you go to Zip Forms, you cannot get the new form. That's the perfect. I see Larry shaking. Larry's already figured this out. Help me out here, Larry. You can't get the new form today. When they put the new form out, you can't get the old form. it's gone. So as I said before, I have, because I'm an instructor, I have a non-sample form, and I printed them up, and had Lindsay send them to you because it's easier to read than having sample written across them. But please don't use that form. Don't use that PDF anyway. You should be using it out of zip form. Just wait until you log in. And if you log in and whoa, there is the new form, you'll start using it. If it's not there, you can't use it. You should not use it.
Well, I think this answers the next question then. As a seller's agent, how long after the 13th can we accept the old RPA from buyers?
Not one day. After the new one's released, do not accept the old one. There are so many. And I mean, you can buy a house with a notebook sheet of paper. I'll pay you $600,000 and you give me the house tomorrow. Everybody signs it. There's a lot of other disclosures that have to be made and stuff like that, to be legal. But there's no law that says a specific RPA has to be used. The problem with using the old RPA is there's a lot of protections built into the new RPA for both entities, buyers and sellers. And there's a thing called best practice. And so best practice means you are legally obligated to do your best. And best practice includes using current forms. So you would lose a lawsuit if the buyer felt damage, or the seller, it doesn't matter, or the seller felt damage, because if we used the new offer, I wouldn't have been damaged, but the agents allowed the old offer to be used. Well, that's legal, but you could be liable to the damages the client had. Why? Because their attorney would easily make a case you did not do best practice. So best practice tells you not to use the old form one day, after the new form's out. So you accept an offer today and the new form comes out tomorrow, but you accepted it today, you're okay. If you have an offer and you're going to respond to it today and the new form came out, I would argue you're still okay if you want. But don't write an old form, or tomorrow or the day later, don't receive an old form. I wrote it a week ago and I don't want to rewrite it. Well, that tells you already you got a problem with that buyer's agent. That answers.
One last question from Darcy. Can't the seller counter that the buyer is to pay up to the purchase price if it appraises for less?
Well, you could put that in. I'm not sure you need to. I mean, the appraisal does not affect the purchase price. I mean, if absent any other dialogue that you're putting in the offer, I mean, you might have to put that in if the buyer wrote some kind of weird thing. See, so maybe call me, but in general, let's just say they said they're going to pay $800,000 and they're waiving their appraisal contingency. Well, you don't need language saying if it appraises for less, you still have to pay $800. You don't need that because they have to pay $800. That's the agreement. The purchase price is the agreement. So Darcy, absent any other wording in the offer, I wouldn't do that. But now maybe the offer has some kind of, we'll pay this, we'll pay that, we won't pay this, and the price. Then you want to clean that up and you simply say sale price shall be. Period.
It was that one area, Walt, that showed in the new RPA where you could say that the buyer won't pay more than $750. There was all that confusion there. But if you counter it saying very specifically, no, where that box is, that new box.
Well, excuse me, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it doesn't say what the buyer will pay. See, that's the point I made earlier. Let me be real clear for people else who maybe I haven't been clear, my fault. That box simply says what the appraisal contingency is.
Okay.
It does not have any effect on purchase price contractually.
But then it would affect them possibly with the contingency, them being able to say, well, okay, it only appraised for $700. Sorry, I'm out of here. Where if you counter it saying, no, you are going to pay the difference, no matter what it appraises for, you're going to pay the difference up to the purchase price, then they can't use that as a contingency, can they?
Here's a simpler way to do it.
Okay.
Remove the appraisal contingency.
Yeah.
Or if they say, what if it only appraises for 300? All right, well then put 300 in the box. It'll appraise for at least 300. Okay. So yeah, I would not mess too much purchase price and appraisal. Don't put those two together without calling me, because that's where you get in trouble. You think you're saying one thing, and believe me, I've dealt with this for more than a year. I've done 2 webinars on it. Trying to link appraisal and purchase price together. It can be done, but it has to be done very carefully.
Okay.
Purchase price is purchase price. Appraisal contingency is appraisal contingency. They're separate. And if you want not to have an appraisal contingency, simply have them waive it.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
That it?
That's it.
All right. Well, folks, we ran a little long, but that was partly for the questions. I hope I got through everything okay. I went a little fast. I felt a little bad. I wanted to get as much done as I could. Hopefully it was clear. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call me, email me, ring my cell phone, text my cell phone. I'm happy to respond. And otherwise, have a great, great day.